From fire to glory, a human saved an alien girl, and empires submitted. Part 1. The mining colony of Seven was burning. Danny Cole could see the flames rising from the underground tunnels even from orbit, great plumes of orange and black smoke pushing through the surface vents like the moon itself was trying to breathe out poison. He had been hauling cargo along the frontier for 12 years, and he had seen plenty of industrial accidents, but nothing like this. The whole facility was coming apart. Sat beside him in the cockpit of their small cargo ship, her fingers moving across the communication panel as emergency broadcasts flooded every channel. The Empire had claimed this moon decades ago, and now their military vessels were descending in waves, trying to evacuate their personnel before the chain reaction consumed everything. Danny watched the chaos unfold and felt the old familiar weight settle in his chest. He had been a rescue worker back on Earth, years ago, before he decided he could not handle the losses anymore. He had traded burning buildings for quiet cargo runs, trading one kind of loneliness for another. But the instincts never left. They lived in his bones like old scars. Looked up from her panel with worry in her eyes. She was a good partner, sharp and practical, and she knew him better than anyone. She could see what he was thinking before he said it. "Do not even consider it," she said. "This is not our problem. They have their own rescue teams, their own equipment. We are just haulers." Danny did not answer. He was studying his scanner, watching the life signs flicker and fade across the underground complex. Most of the survivors were already being pulled out by the military. But there was one signal, faint and weak, coming from a section deep in the eastern tunnels, a section that they had already marked as lost. "They wrote off the eastern wing," said. "The structural supports are gone. Anyone who goes in there is not coming out." Danny expanded the scan. The life sign was small, too small to be an adult. A child, alone in the dark while the world burned around them. He thought about the last time he had walked away from a situation like this, back on Earth, when his commander had ordered a retreat and he had obeyed. The building had collapsed 20 minutes later. He still remembered the names of the people they left behind. "I have to go," he said quietly. Grabbed his arm. "Danny, the temperature in those tunnels is beyond what your suit can handle. The air is toxic. The whole section could collapse at any moment. You will die in there." "Maybe," Danny said, "but that child will definitely die if I do not try." He stood up and moved toward the equipment locker, pulling out his breathing unit and the heat-resistant suit he kept for emergencies. It was rated for extreme conditions, but nothing like what waited below. He would have maybe 20 minutes before the suit failed completely, maybe less. Followed him, anger and fear fighting for control of her voice. "This is insane. You do not even know if that child is still alive. The signal could be a malfunction. You could be throwing your life away for nothing." Danny sealed the suit and checked his oxygen levels. "Then I will know for sure," he said. "Either way, I will not spend the rest of my life wondering." He moved to the airlock before she could argue further. The cargo ship descended through the smoke and flames, finding a landing spot near one of the emergency access points. Danny stepped out into hell. The heat hit him immediately, pressing against his suit like a living thing trying to crush him. The ground beneath his feet was cracked and glowing, and the air was thick with ash and toxic fumes. He could hear the distant rumble of collapsing structures, the groaning of metal pushed beyond its limits. The scanner in his hand pointed him toward the eastern tunnels, and he started walking. The tunnel entrance was half blocked by fallen debris, but Danny squeezed through, ignoring the warnings flashing on his suit display. Temperature critical, air quality dangerous, structural integrity failing. He pushed deeper into the darkness, following the faint signal like a lifeline. The fire had consumed most of the tunnel, leaving behind twisted metal and shattered equipment. Danny moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The floor was unstable, ready to give way at any moment. Sweat poured down his face inside the helmet, and his breathing grew ragged as the suit struggled to keep him alive. He found her in a storage alcove, half buried under a collapsed shelving unit. A child, no more than 7 years old by their standards, with pale blue skin and wide, terrified eyes. She was injured, her leg trapped under the debris, and she was crying silently, too exhausted and scared to make a sound. Danny knelt beside her and spoke gently, even though he knew she probably could not understand his language. "It is okay," he said. "I am here to help. I am going to get you out." He studied the debris, calculating the weight and the angles. His suit display showed he had maybe 10 minutes left before total failure, not enough time to be careful. He braced himself and lifted, feeling his muscles scream in protest as the shelving unit shifted. The child whimpered in pain as her leg came free, but she was alive. She was alive. Danny gathered her in his arms, cradling her against his chest. She was small and fragile, and she clung to him with desperate strength. He noticed the markings on her clothing, strange symbols that meant nothing to him. He did not care who she was or what family she came from. She was a child who needed help, and that was enough. The journey back was a nightmare. The tunnels were collapsing around them, and Danny had to dodge falling debris while carrying the girl. His suit was failing, the heat seeping through, and he could feel his skin beginning to burn. But he did not stop. He could not stop. He burst out of the tunnel entrance just as the whole section gave way behind him, a wall of fire and smoke chasing him into the open air. He stumbled and fell to his knees, still holding the child, still protecting her with his body. When he looked up, a warship was descending from the sky. Soldiers surrounded him within seconds, their weapons raised, their faces hidden behind masks. Danny had no strength left to fight or run. He simply held the child closer and waited. One of the soldiers stepped forward and froze when she saw the markings on the girl's clothing. She spoke rapidly into her communicator, her voice sharp with disbelief. Danny did not understand the words, but he understood the reaction. The soldiers lowered their weapons. More ships were coming, and the child in his arms was stirring, looking up at him with eyes full of something that might have been wonder. He had just saved the only daughter of the High Empress. From fire to glory, a human saved an alien girl, an empire submitted. Part 2. Danny woke in a room that smelled like medicine and metal. The ceiling above him was high and curved, covered in patterns that shifted and glowed with soft light. He tried to sit up, but pain lanced through his body, and he fell back against the bed with a groan. His arms were wrapped in bandages, and he could feel the tight pull of treated burns across his chest and shoulders. He was alive. That surprised him more than anything else. The room was large and clean, filled with equipment he did not recognize. Medical technology, he guessed, far more advanced than anything he had access to on his cargo ship. There were guards at the door, tall figures in dark armor who watched him with expressions he could not read. A door slid open, and a male entered. He was older than the guards, with sharp features and cold eyes. His uniform marked him as someone important, someone with authority. He studied Danny the way a scientist might study an interesting specimen. "You are awake," he said. His voice was calm and measured, but there was suspicion underneath. "My name is Commander. I am head of Imperial Security. You will answer my questions." Danny swallowed, his throat dry and raw. "Where is my friend? The woman who was with me on the ship?" "She is being held separately. She is unharmed." Commander moved closer, his eyes never leaving Danny's face. "You went into the tunnels. You retrieved the child. Why?" Danny blinked at the question. "She was trapped. She would have died." "That is not an answer." Commander's voice hardened. "You are human, a cargo hauler with no connection to the Empire. You had no obligation to risk your life. You had no reason to believe you would survive, and yet you went in anyway. Why?" Danny thought about the question, turning it over in his mind. He had asked himself the same thing 100 times over the years. Why did he run toward danger when everyone else ran away? Why could he not simply walk past suffering and pretend he had not seen it? "Because she was scared," Danny said finally. "Because she was alone, because I could help." Commander stared at him for a long moment, and something flickered in his expression. Confusion, perhaps, or frustration. In culture, every action had a purpose. Every choice was weighed against potential benefit. The idea of risking everything for nothing in return did not fit into any category he understood. "You expect no reward," he said slowly. "You want nothing from us." "I want my friend released," Danny said. "I want to leave, that is all." Before Commander could respond, the door opened again. This time, the guards straightened to attention, and even the Commander stepped back with a bow of his head. A woman entered the room, and Danny knew immediately that she was someone of immense power. She was tall and elegant, with pale blue skin and eyes that seemed to see everything at once. Her clothing was simple but clearly expensive, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had never been challenged in her life. She studied Danny the way a queen might study a peasant who had somehow wandered into her throne room. "High Empress," Commander said, "this is the human." Did not acknowledge him. She walked to Danny's bedside and looked down at him, her expression unreadable. Danny met her gaze without flinching. He had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. He had done what he believed was right, and he would accept whatever consequences followed. "My daughter tells me you carried her through fire," said. Her voice was cool and controlled, but there was something underneath, something that might have been curiosity. "She says you spoke to her gently, even though she could not understand your words. She says you protected her with your own body." "I did what anyone would do," Danny said. No, shook her head slowly. "You did what almost no one would do. My own soldiers abandoned the eastern section. They calculated the risks and decided the potential losses were acceptable. You made a different calculation." "I did not calculate anything," Danny admitted. "I just went." Studied him for a long moment, and Danny had the strange feeling that she was seeing him more clearly than anyone ever had. She had ruled an empire for decades. She had dealt with politicians and generals and diplomats from 100 different species. She knew how to read people, how to find their hidden motives and secret desires. But Danny had no hidden motives. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a tired man who had seen too much suffering and could not stop himself from trying to help. "My daughter wishes to see you," said finally. "Against the advice of my security council, I have decided to allow it. You will be brought to her when you are well enough to walk." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. She looked back at Danny, and for just a moment the mask of the Empress slipped, and he saw the mother underneath, the woman who had almost lost her only child. "I am told that humans expect compensation for their services," she said. "Name your price, ships, wealth, territory, whatever you desire, it will be granted." Danny shook his head. "I do not want anything. Just release my friend and let us go." Eyes widened slightly. In all her years of rule, no one had ever refused her gifts. No one had ever walked away from the chance to gain power and influence. This human had saved the life of her daughter, and he wanted nothing in return. She left without another word, but Danny could see that his answer had disturbed her deeply. 2 days later, Danny was well enough to walk. The guards escorted him through the massive warship, past corridors filled with soldiers and officials who stared at him with open curiosity. Word had spread. Everyone knew about the human who had walked through fire. Was waiting for him in a garden, a beautiful space filled with plants from a dozen different worlds. She was small and delicate, with the same pale blue skin as her mother, and she smiled when she saw him. It was the first genuine smile Danny had seen since arriving on the ship. She ran to him and grabbed his hand, speaking rapidly in her own language. Danny did not understand the words, but he understood the feeling behind them: gratitude, trust, the simple, uncomplicated love of a child who had been saved from darkness. An attendant translated for her. "She says you are her fire walker. She says she feels safe when you are near." Danny knelt down so he was at her level. He smiled gently and spoke slowly, knowing the words would be translated. "You are safe now. You do not need to be afraid anymore." Threw her arms around him and hugged him tightly. And in that moment, something changed in the galactic order. A human had earned the love of a princess, and empires were beginning to take notice. From fire to glory, a human saved an alien girl, and empires submitted. Part 3. The news spread across the galactic sector like wildfire. A human cargo hauler had walked into a burning tunnel, rescued the daughter of the High Empress, and asked for nothing in return. The story was told in 1,000 different languages, shared on communication networks from one end of civilized space to the other, and everywhere it went, it raised the same question: what kind of creature does something like that? Danny and were released from the flagship a week after the rescue. Their cargo ship was returned to them, fully repaired and restocked with supplies they had not asked for. They did not know how to repay a debt when the person refused payment, so they paid in small ways instead. Better equipment, cleaner fuel, a navigation system that was worth more than the entire ship. Wanted to leave immediately, to disappear into the frontier and let the whole incident fade into memory. But it was already too late for that. When they lifted off from the flagship, 3 vessels fell into formation around them. One was assigned by the Empress herself to ensure their safety. The other 2 were unknown, watching from a distance, following without making contact. "We have become interesting," said grimly. "That is never a good thing." Danny did not argue. He knew she was right. He had spent 12 years being invisible, just another human hauling cargo between stations that nobody cared about. Now he was visible. Now powerful people were paying attention, and powerful people always wanted something. The first contact came from the collective. Their ambassador, a tall, thin being named, requested a meeting on neutral ground. They were one of the three great powers in the sector, an empire built on logic and calculation. They had studied every species in the galaxy and reduced them all to mathematical equations. They believed they understood how the universe worked. But they did not understand Danny Cole. The meeting took place on a space station at the edge of territory. Was waiting when Danny arrived, surrounded by assistants who recorded everything and analyzed every word. He studied Danny with eyes that held no emotion, only curiosity. "We have reviewed the data from the incident on 7, said. His voice was flat and precise. "You entered a tunnel with a survival probability of 6%. You carried an alien child through conditions that should have killed you. You suffered injuries that will leave permanent scars, and you refused all compensation." "That is correct," Danny said. "This behavior is statistically impossible," leaned forward slightly. "No rational being would accept those odds for a stranger of another species. The risk-reward calculation does not support your actions." Danny shrugged. "I did not make a calculation. I saw a child who needed help. I helped." "But why?" pressed. "There must be a reason, a hidden benefit, a psychological compulsion, something that explains this deviation from expected behavior." Danny thought about how to answer. They saw the universe as a machine, a collection of parts that moved according to predictable rules. They could not accept that sometimes people did things simply because they felt right. "Humans are not machines," Danny said finally. "We do not always act on logic. Sometimes we act on feeling, on instinct, on the knowledge that someone is suffering and we have the power to help. We do not need a reason beyond that." Stared at him for a long moment, and Danny saw something in those cold eyes that might have been fear. They had built their entire civilization on the belief that all behavior could be predicted and controlled. If humans truly acted without calculation, without predictable patterns, then they were the most dangerous species in the galaxy. The meeting ended without resolution. Had more questions than answers, and Danny had no interest in providing explanations that would not be believed anyway. But as they left the station, noticed that the ships were no longer just watching. They were gathering data, taking readings, trying to understand something that could not be understood through analysis alone. The second contact was very different. The Dominion sent no ambassador. They sent a warlord. Was massive, twice the size of any human, with thick gray skin and eyes like burning coals. His people were warriors, a culture built on strength and honor and the glory of combat. They had conquered half their sector through force of arms, and they respected only those who proved themselves worthy. But worthiness in culture did not always mean victory. Sometimes it meant courage. Sometimes it meant sacrifice. Sometimes it meant walking into fire when every instinct screamed to run away. Did not ask questions. He did not demand explanations. He simply looked at Danny with something that might have been respect and made a declaration. "You fought an enemy that could not be defeated through strength," said. His voice was deep and rumbling, like thunder in the distance. "The fire did not care about your weapons or your armor. It only cared about consuming everything in its path. And you went in anyway. You carried a child through the heart of destruction and emerged victorious." "I was just trying to help," Danny said. Shook his head. "You were being human, and that is something we have not seen before." He assigned an honor guard to Danny's ship, 4 warriors who would follow him wherever he went. Danny tried to refuse but would not hear of it. In culture, witnessing courage created an obligation. By saving the princess, Danny had earned the respect of the Dominion, whether he wanted it or not. Back on the flagship, High Empress was receiving reports from across the sector. Every intelligence agency, every diplomatic corps, every military command was talking about the same thing. The human, the fire walker, the man who did the impossible and wanted nothing for it. Her daughter had not stopped talking about him either. She drew pictures of the rescue, showing a small figure in a dark tunnel being carried by a larger figure wreathed in flames. She called Danny her protector, her hero, her fire walker. She asked when she would see him again. Studied the reports and made her decision. The galaxy was changing. The old balance of power was shifting, and at the center of it all was a simple human who did not even realize what he had started. She sent a message to Danny's ship, inviting him to the imperial capital for a formal ceremony of gratitude. It would be broadcast across the entire sector. Every empire would be watching. Every species would see what happened when humanity was given a chance to stand among the stars. Danny received the invitation and felt his stomach drop. He was a cargo hauler. He fixed engines and hauled freight and slept in cramped cabins. He was not meant for ceremonies and politics and the attention of empires. But put her hand on his shoulder and spoke quietly. "You started this," she said. "You saved that little girl, and now the whole galaxy is watching. You cannot hide from that. The only question is what you do next." Danny looked out at the stars and knew she was right. He had walked through fire once. Now he would have to walk through something far more dangerous. The spotlight of an empire. The weight of expectations he never asked for. The chance to shape the future of humanity in a galaxy that was only beginning to understand what humans could be. He set a course for Prime and tried not to think about what waited there. From fire to glory, a human saved an alien girl, an empire submitted. Part 4. Prime was beautiful in a way that made Danny feel small and out of place. The capital world of the empire was covered in gleaming cities that stretched toward the sky, towers of crystal and light that had stood for thousands of years. Millions have lived here, going about their lives in a civilization that was ancient when humanity was still learning to make fire. Danny's cargo ship landed in a docking bay reserved for honored guests. The moment he stepped off the ramp, he was surrounded by attendants and guards and officials who all seemed to want something from him. They spoke rapidly in the language, gesturing toward vehicles and buildings and crowds that had gathered just to catch a glimpse of the human firewalker. Stayed close beside him, her expression tight with tension. She did not like crowds, did not like being the center of attention, but she had refused to let Danny face this alone. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The ceremony was scheduled for the following day in a massive hall called the Hall of Eternal Flames. The name felt appropriate, given everything that had happened. Danny spent the night in guest quarters that were larger than his entire ship, trying to sleep and failing. He kept thinking about the way she had clung to him in the tunnel, about the trust in her eyes when she looked at him. He had not asked for any of this. He had just wanted to save a scared child. But somehow that simple act had grown into something far bigger than he could control. The morning of the ceremony arrived too quickly. Danny was dressed in formal clothing provided by the Simple and Elegant, designed to show respect without drawing attention. He looked at himself in the mirror and barely recognized the man staring back. He still felt like a cargo hauler. He suspected he always would. The Hall of Eternal Flames was overwhelming. The ceiling rose hundreds of feet above, decorated with murals that depicted the history of the empire. Great pillars of carved stone lined the walls, and in the center of the hall, a massive flame burned in a basin of polished metal. Thousands have filled the viewing galleries, and floating cameras broadcast the ceremony to every corner of the sector. Danny saw representatives from the collective, their cold eyes watching everything with calculating interest. He saw warriors standing in full ceremonial armor, Warlord among them, his massive form impossible to miss. He saw diplomats and officials from dozens of other species, all gathered to witness what would happen next. And at the far end of the hall, seated on a throne of white crystal, was High Empress. Beside her, in a smaller chair, sat. The child's face lit up when she saw Danny, and she waved with unrestrained enthusiasm. Danny felt something warm in his chest, something that pushed back against the fear and uncertainty. The ceremony began with speeches and rituals that Danny did not fully understand. Priests spoke words in the old language. Flames were kindled and offered to ancient spirits. The weight of tradition pressed down on the hall like a physical thing, reminding everyone present that the empire had existed for and would exist for more. Then rose from her throne and walked to the center of the hall. The crowd fell silent, every camera focused on her, and she spoke. "We gather today to honor a debt that cannot be repaid," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "A human walked into fire to save my daughter. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. He simply acted because a child was in danger and he had the power to help." She turned to look at Danny, and her eyes held something that might have been admiration. "We have studied humanity for generations," she continued. "We have watched them spread across the stars, building colonies and trading posts in the spaces between great empires. We considered them useful but unremarkable. We were wrong." Raised her hand, and the hall grew even quieter. "Today, I propose something unprecedented. A formal alliance between the empire and the human colonies, not as subjects or servants but as equals. as partners in shaping the future of this galaxy. The reaction was immediate. Murmurs swept through the crowd. The ambassador stood, his face showing the first emotion Danny had ever seen from him: shock, concern, perhaps even fear. "High Empress," Ambassador said, his voice cutting through the noise. "This is unwise. Humans are unpredictable. Their behavior cannot be modeled or controlled. An alliance with them would destabilize the entire sector." Warlord stepped forward, his deep voice drowning out the, "And that is exactly why we should welcome them. They have grown strong through challenge. Humans represent a challenge we have never faced. I support this alliance." The debate exploded across the hall. Voices rose and fell, arguments clashing like weapons. Danny stood in the middle of it all, feeling like a small boat caught in a storm. He had not asked for any of this. He had just wanted to save a little girl. Then something happened that no one expected. A hissing sound filled the air. People began to cough. Guards shouted warnings, and chaos erupted as the crowd realized that something was wrong with the air itself. Danny felt his throat tighten, felt a burning sensation in his lungs. Someone was pumping poison into the ventilation system. But Danny had spent years on frontier stations where air quality was a matter of survival. He recognized the smell, the taste, the way his body was reacting. This was a toxin designed to target humans specifically. Someone wanted him dead. He should have run, he should have tried to save himself. But his eyes found in the chaos her small face twisted with fear, and he did not even think. He simply moved. Danny pushed through the panicking crowd, ignoring the burning in his lungs. He reached and scooped her up in his arms, shielding her with his body just as he had done in the burning tunnel. Guards surrounded and began moving her toward safety, but Danny did not follow them. He moved toward the nearest exit, carrying, trusting to handle everything else. Was already at the environmental controls, working with security to seal the affected sections and flush the toxin from the system. She had always been the practical one, the one who solved problems while Danny ran toward danger. Together, they had survived 100 close calls. This would not be any different. The toxin was contained within minutes. The assassins, a small faction within the court who resented the Empress and feared human influence, were captured before they could escape. The ceremony was interrupted, but no one died. The plot had failed. Danny sat in a quiet room afterward, still clinging to him, her small hands gripping his shirt. She was trembling but unharmed. She had been saved by her firewalker once again. Found them there. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the human who held her daughter with such gentleness. The human who had refused rewards and honors, who had run toward danger twice now when any sane being would have run away. "The alliance will proceed," she said quietly. "Anyone who opposes it will answer to me." Danny looked up at her. He was exhausted and hurting, and wanted nothing more than to return to his quiet life hauling cargo between forgotten stations. But he understood now that his quiet life was over. He had become something larger than himself, a symbol of what humanity could be. "Thank you," he said simply. "No," replied, "thank you, for showing us what we had forgotten. That sometimes the greatest strength is not power or wealth or strategy. Sometimes it is simply the courage to care." From fire to glory, a human saved an alien girl, an empire submitted. Part 5. 6 months had passed since the ceremony in the Hall of Eternal Flames. The galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The alliance between the Empire and humanity was now official, signed and sealed and broadcast to every corner of civilized space. But that was only the beginning. The Dominion had requested human advisors. Warlord wanted to understand how humans thought, how they fought, how they made decisions in the heat of battle. His warriors were strong and disciplined, but they relied on patterns and traditions that had served them for centuries. Humans were different. Humans improvised. Humans found solutions that should not have existed, believed that learning from them would make his people stronger. The collective had launched a massive study of human behavior. Thousands of researchers were analyzing everything from human history to human art to human psychology. They were trying to build a model that could predict what humans would do, but they kept running into the same problem. Humans did not follow the rules. They made choices based on emotion and instinct and values that could not be. The more they studied, the more confused they became. Danny Cole had tried to return to his old life. He had taken a few cargo runs along the frontier, delivering supplies to stations that needed them. But everywhere they went, people recognized them. The story had spread too far, grown too large to escape. Danny was not just a hauler anymore. He was the fire walker. He was the human who had saved a princess and changed the course of history. He did not feel like a hero. He still woke up some nights with nightmares about the burning tunnel, about the heat pressing against his suit, about the child crying in the dark. He still carried scars on his arms and chest, reminders of what he had done. But when people looked at him, they did not see a tired man with bad dreams. They saw hope. Had not forgotten him. She sent messages regularly, sharing stories about her lessons and her friends and the things she was learning about the galaxy. She called him her firewalker in every message, and she had started learning human languages so she could speak to him directly. Allowed it, even encouraged it. The bond between her daughter and the human had become something precious, something worth protecting. A summit was called on neutral ground, the first of its kind. Representatives from the three great empires gathered along with the human delegation to discuss the future. Danny was asked to attend, not as a diplomat or a politician, but as a witness, the person who had started it all. The summit hall was smaller than the Hall of Eternal Flames, but it felt just as significant. Leaders who had never sat in the same room before were now facing each other across a circular table. High Empress represented the ambassador, spoke for the warlord, stood for the, and a woman named led the human delegation, a career diplomat who had spent her entire life preparing for a moment like this. The discussions were long and complicated: trade agreements, border disputes, military cooperation, cultural exchange. Every topic required negotiation, compromise, and careful balancing of interests. But underneath all the politics, something else was happening. The three empires were learning to see each other differently, and they were all learning to see humanity. Near the end of the summit, asked Danny to speak. He tried to refuse, but she insisted. The galaxy needed to hear from the man who had started this. They needed to understand what humanity truly was. Danny stood before the assembled leaders and felt the weight of their attention. He was not a speaker. He was not a politician. He was just a cargo hauler who had done something foolish and survived. But he thought about the way she had clung to him in the fire, and he found the words. "I am not special," he said quietly. "I am not stronger or smarter or braver than anyone else. I am just a human, and humans are not special either. We are not the most powerful species in the galaxy. We are not the most advanced or the most ancient or the most wise." He paused and looked around the room. "But we have something that we cannot help, something that is built into who we are. When we see someone suffering, we want to help. When we see a child in danger, we cannot walk away. We do not calculate the odds or weigh the costs. We just act." Danny thought about his life, about all the choices he had made. Some of them were good, some of them were mistakes, but they were all driven by the same thing, the same instinct that would not let him ignore suffering, the same voice in his heart that said someone needs help and I can give it. "That is not a weakness," he continued. "That is not something to be afraid of. That is who we are, and I believe that is why we are here today. Not because of power or strategy or politics, but because somewhere along the way you saw something in us that you had forgotten in yourselves. The willingness to act without calculation, the courage to sacrifice without expectation, the ability to hope without certainty." The room was silent when he finished. Danny felt foolish and exposed, standing there in front of beings who had ruled empires for longer than humanity had existed. But then Warlord rose to his feet and placed his fist over his heart in the salute of respect. "Well spoken, Firewalker," he said. "You have given us much to consider." Ambassador did not salute, but he inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement that was more than Danny had expected. "We will continue our studies," he said. "Perhaps there are some things that cannot be modeled. Perhaps that is not a flaw." High Empress simply smiled. She had understood from the beginning. She had seen it in her daughter's eyes, in the way trusted the human who had saved her. Some things could not be explained or analyzed. Some things simply were. The summit ended with a new accord. Not just an alliance, but a recognition. Humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through conquest or technology or wealth, but through something far simpler, through the willingness to care. Danny returned to his ship afterward, waiting for him in the cockpit. They had cargo to haul, contracts to fulfill. The galaxy still needed haulers, even ones who had become famous, especially ones who had become famous. Before they departed, a message arrived from. Danny opened it and found a drawing. It showed a small figure and a larger figure standing together on an unknown world, surrounded by stars. At the bottom, in careful human letters, she had written 2 words. "Thank you." Danny smiled and saved the drawing to his personal files. Then he looked out at the stars and thought about everything that had happened. He had walked through fire and emerged changed. He had become a symbol of something he did not fully understand. He had helped shape the future of an entire galaxy. But in the end, he was still just Danny Cole, a cargo hauler with a small ship and a good friend and a long road ahead. That was enough. That had always been enough. Looked at him from the pilot's seat, ready to go. Danny nodded. "Let us fly." The ship lifted off and joined the stream of traffic leaving the station. Behind them, empires were bending toward a new future. Ahead of them, the stars waited, full of possibility and danger and the endless chance to do something good. From fire to glory. That was what they were calling his story now. But Danny knew the truth. It had never been about glory. It had only ever been about a child who needed help and a man who could not walk away. That was the human way. That was why empires had submitted, not to strength or power or fear, but to something far more simple, far more powerful. Love.